Hello and welcome to the War on Terror Film Festival, continuing, I guess, coverage or panel discussion immediately after the film USA versus Al-Arian. And I'm joined by the panelists today, Lena Halberson. She's a film director of the film USA versus Al-Arian. Professor Wadie Said, he is a University of Law professor at the University of South Carolina. And Abdullah Al-Arian, who is the son of Dr. Arian, but he's also an associate professor at the University of Georgetown or Georgetown University. Welcome all of you for being with us on this panel, and thank you for our viewers who are joining us from around the world for this first of its kind War on Terror Film Festival. Of course, it's not anything festive, it's for lack of a better word, but it's a film festival that's spanning 20 years, 20 films. Actually, it's 21 films, but 20 films for the 20 years of the War on Terror to raise awareness about what's been happening and the consequences of the War on Terrorism that's led by the United States, our country here, and the impact it's had and the stories that go beyond the front lines, beyond the actual physical war itself on battlefields. What's happening to the families that are caught up in this dragnet. And today we saw this riveting story about USA versus Al-Arian, which it took place in Tampa, Florida, where Professor Samuel Arian was a university professor at the University of South Florida. Just as for introduction purposes, my name is Ahmed Bedier, and I from Tampa, Florida. And I never actually, before Dr. Samuel Arian's arrest, I never actually met him or met any of his family members. But shortly after 9/11, I started becoming an activist and getting involved in human rights and civil rights and defending Muslim rights. And I joined this organization called CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and started the chapter for CARE in Tampa. And the first first press conference I've ever done was at the courthouse. Outside the downtown courthouse, the federal courthouse in Tampa, when Dr. Samuel Arian was arrested. I got a phone call from Washington saying, from the CARE office in Washington saying there was this arrest today and there's going to be a press conference. You need to go down there and speak about, due process and defending people's rights. And I've never done a press conference before. And I went down there and there were so many, it was just overwhelming, but, I winged it, didn't really know what I was doing. And that began my involvement in the case and watched it happen. Throughout the trial, of course, I didn't get a chance to meet Dr. Al-Arian, but I met his wonderful family. And of course, later on, I did actually meet him once he was able to be freed. But having said that, I want to get into the conversation here and start with all of you. Well, specifically with Abdullah, being that you're the family member. The film just ended with a statement from you at the end. Because what's unique about this film is it's almost like you reach this climax of the film where the verdict comes out. And you think like in most films that's like, the end of the film. But with the Al-Arian family and the saga of Dr. Al-Arian, that's not really where the story ends. It's kind of almost like in the beginning or the middle of the story. So it's interesting because you have this climatic moment where people are celebrating and stuff coming out of the courthouse, and then everybody's celebrating, but Dr. Al-Arian goes back to jail and remains there. So tell us, because this film was, I think, finished in 2007 or 2008, what actually happened after that and since then?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that the U.S. justice system doesn't really lend itself to Hollywood endings. The way that we thought the case was going to go is not obviously the way that it ended up going at that time, right? So there was a not guilty verdict. There was that moment of euphoria, that moment of sort of complete disbelief, really, that against all of those odds that you saw kind of being stacked up over the course of those years of both pre-trial and then the actual trial itself, there was a sense that, once it was over, it was supposed to be over, but the US government doesn't take losing very well, as we learned, and they were very quickly working to pressure him into either going back to trial for retrial on the remaining charges on which the jury was still hung, or trying to pressure him into accepting a plea deal. The plea deal that you saw initially offered, of course, was a sort of non-starter. And so for that, I think my father tried to hold out as long as he possibly could until he got the deal that he basically got to write almost himself, especially in terms of what they call the overt acts, the things that he was actually agreeing to. He said he didn't want to lie in this agreement in terms of any actions or any things that he'd done. And then when, of course, the agreement was signed, the government immediately used that time that he would spend, that additional time in prison that we saw, that kind of really, shocking statement by the judge, to then try to bring about a new case. And so everything that was happening in Florida was sort of one half of the story. And the second half of the story is when the case moved to Virginia, because of a very kind of overzealous prosecutor there who had made it sort of his kind of personal crusade to go and prosecute a number of Muslim activists in the aftermath of 9/11. And this was certainly a case that he had a lot of interest in. And so he tried to compel my father to testify in unrelated cases, even though my father's plea agreement very specifically requested that he not have to cooperate with the government in any capacity. And so then we moved into a completely new phase that went on for another, really almost a decade, when you actually think about not just the extra time he spent in prison on these civil contempt charges, and then later there was a criminal contempt case that was being delayed through the courts. Eventually, my father was released under house arrest, and it was only very late in the Obama administration that finally the Justice Department basically gave up. They dropped the last remaining charge, which was that criminal contempt case. And the only thing that was left at that point was for my father to find a country that would be willing to accept him, since he had accepted to leave the U.S. after having lived there for 40 years. He left for Turkey ultimately in 2015.
When you summarize it this way, it kind of seems like it went by, but during that time it seemed like it was taking forever, and there was so many maneuvers. And just when you think that the end is near, it just it's another criminal contempt, or it's another contempt, it's a hearing. And I think some people felt at the time that the government was being vindictive because they couldn't get a guilty verdict, so they were trying to find other ways to get him on, whether it's contempt or lying to the government, or another opportunity to actually get him to testify under oath, when the Constitution gives you the right to remain silent, but it was just another way to try to break that silence. I want to move to Lena Halberson. Lena, you're Norwegian, you're not American, you're not from this country, you're from Norway, not Palestinian, you're not from the Middle East, you're not Muslim, but you decide to make this film, USA versus Al-Arian. How did you find out about Dr. Samuel Al-Arian, and what made you interested in actually making a film about his case?
Well, I had been living in Palestine for 2 years, where I made a film called The Stone's Throw Away about children living under occupation. And I was traveling around in the States on a tour with this film, while living in Lakeland, Florida, actually. And
weird place to be.
Yeah, it was a strange place to be
for a Norwegian.
Yeah. But traveling around, I heard about a lot of stories about what had happened to Muslims in America after 9/11. And everywhere I went, people were talking about this Samuel Al-Arian, this professor that was highly regarded among everyone I met, and they were really shocked about this case. And also on TV in Florida, I kept seeing these commercials. It was in a senator debate, and I kept seeing these commercials where they were all like throwing bad stuff at this professor. And I thought it was a really strange case. And then one day I was invited to screen my film in Tampa. And at the screening, there was a woman, a Palestinian woman, and I overheard her talk to a friend about her daughter. And I was wondering, and they were saying, oh, it's because of the case of the father, so it's like, who's the father of this girl that's struggling? And then I realized that this was the wife of Samuel Al-Arian. So I met Nala, and I think we went out for coffee a couple of times, and I got to, hear her story, and then I got to meet the family, and then I asked them if I could make a film about the case, because the date for the trial was set. At that time, he had been 2.5 years in prison in solitary confinement. It was like playing out in front of my eyes. And the family, they were brave enough to participate in this, because they didn't know me, so they didn't know. I think especially the kids, maybe in the beginning, they were a little skeptical because they had some bad experience with the press. But for me, it was really a privilege to enter. And I didn't know, when I started, I didn't know if Samuel Al-Arian was guilty or not guilty, terrorist, not terrorist. And frankly, in the beginning, I wasn't so concerned with that. What was important for me is to see, what is it like to be a child and your father is accused of being a terrorist, and you go to public school, and the family was really isolated because everyone were so afraid, and they were afraid to, be associated with the family. Even though, Samuel Al-Arian did a lot of good things for the community and everybody knew him. But as we see in the film too, the FBI were like going after people who supported him, and people were scared. And the only group that were really supportive was a Christian, like white Christian American group that they dared to do it. But I think the Muslims in Tampa, they were really scared at the time, and I don't blame them. But
right, we're gonna get into a little bit more of that about the community reaction. But I bet when I first met you, also because I was involved at the care office, and I think we had met, and I thought I hadn't made up my mind about you yet, but you turned out to be
and vice versa.
We expect, yeah, and vice versa. That's the thing. Back then, you just don't know. Somebody I did actually see in the courtroom is the next panelist, Wadie Said. He was the co-counsel. He was there present because he was co-counsel for one of the co-conspirators, or alleged co-conspirators, Hatem Fariz. He's now a professor of law at University of South Carolina. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to ask you, how did you get involved in this case, and what made you interested in actually getting involved?
Well, I had a long interest. Thank you, Ahmed, by the way, for the question, and to the Coalition on Civil Freedoms for having me and for being here. I had wanted to get into public defense. I had been working at a law firm in New York City, and it wasn't for me, a corporate law firm. And I'd wanted to get into public defense, so I was just kind of applying, more generally, and I ended up being connected to the federal public defender in Tampa, Florida. At the time, a fellow by the name of Fletcher Peacock, and basically he said, "We have this case. Are you, interested in joining us?" And I thought about it, and it was, kind of logistically a little bit challenging because I was living in New York, and my wife was in law school in New York. It was a strange time. My father was literally on his deathbed when I spoke to Fletcher. So a lot was going on, but ultimately I ended up saying yes. Interestingly, I never told the Al-Arian family that I had a conversation about 4 or 5 months earlier with a very well-known lawyer called Lenny Weinglass, who was considering taking Sammy's case at the time. He'd already been indicted, and I think he was trying to figure out if he could make it work, and if and he asked me what I thought of it and if I was interested in joining him. And I said, what I would do, things like that, if I were to work on it. And in the end, I don't know why, but it didn't work out. I mean, he's a kind of a legendary figure as a leftist lawyer, taken up many important causes. You can even see him, I think, he's portrayed in this movie on Netflix about the Chicago 7. So he's a very famous figure going back into the 60s, helping dissidents and people being essentially persecuted by the government. So I was interested in the case and was considering it for a long time. And then this opportunity came along and I said, okay, I better jump in if I really want to be involved. It seems also a little bit more interesting than starting like in misdemeanor court in New York City and working my way up as a kind of public defender. Although I'm sure, because I'm probably was one of the few people who could speak Arabic, that I was probably going to get pulled into these type of cases anyway. So at least this was a better way, I think, to get involved.
How has your Wadie, I mean, your involvement in this case? You said you wanted to make a shift. Corporate law wasn't for you, but this is not your ordinary case. One, you come from an Arab background yourself, and now you're seeing the government in action with this war on terror, with these type of prosecutions. How did that trial and other, how did that have did it make a difference or impact in the trajectory of your work going forward after that? What kind of impact did it have on you as a criminal defense lawyer?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So the first one is I was really frustrated in the trial in the prosecution for a whole bunch of reasons. Okay, just as a kind of a matter, on matters of sort of law, I always felt that there was a lot more going on that, we couldn't get into in the courtroom. The judge I would make a motion, my colleagues would make a motion, whoever, and the judge would just say denied. And, there's a lot more there. There's a lot more there, and you can't tell a judge you're wrong. I mean, you can appeal, but that's a long process. And, especially at the time, the indictment was at the beginning of 2003, and the trial was sort of the latter half of 2005. The climate in this country, and especially in the Tampa Bay area with respect to Samia and the other defendants, was very, very, from an official point of view, very hostile. And I felt that as well in the courtroom. So, I mean, there was this issue of the issues I didn't feel were being explored, and I felt properly, and I felt that they needed more research, more development, et cetera. Can't do that in a litigation. And then the other thing was that sort of overt hostility that you could sense. I told my wife at the time, I feel like I'm the fifth defendant. I didn't feel like I was treated like the other lawyers. I looked like the defendants, right? And so it was weird because, there were no other Arab American, Palestinian, anyone, on the defense team or on the prosecution for that matter, but that goes without saying. So, and because I was starting out in this career, I feel like I was in a weird position where I really wanted to kind of assert myself a little more. I felt like I knew what the government, what game the government was playing and how to expose it. And especially in the first part of the trial, I felt like I had to do a lot of that by suggesting, to my colleagues in the Federal Public Defender's Office or to, some of the other lawyers, you might want to say this because this is so clearly wrong. And then they would go and say it, and it would, I think a lot of the stuff worked, not because I'm particularly brilliant, just because it was amateur hour on behalf of the prosecution. The things that they were saying, obviously there are political positions that the U.S. government takes regarding the Palestinian issue that, I certainly don't agree with. But, at some point, a political position, meets reality, and you can't kind of gloss over reality. When you start talking about violence and political violence, and then advocacy and protected speech and things like that, the law has something to say about. It's supposed to operate in a neutral manner. Then I think you can really push back. Because the final thing I'll say just in this comment is that basically one of the unique aspects of this case was it was the first of a series of 3 targeting Palestinians who had what I would maybe call, Islamist links, or, approach the issue from a more kind of Muslim perspective, a religious perspective. And they were being targeted for their activity in the United States, which was entirely peaceable or peaceful, wasn't violent, which is a huge break from the pre-9/11 prosecutions, where terrorism prosecutions involved people who were prosecuted for carrying out certain acts, violent acts. So this was a unique kind of experience. And when you take that step to go after people whose activity is nonviolent, because the government wants to view their advocacy as connected to terrorism, supportive of terrorism, the government may be convinced of that point of view, but explaining to ordinary people, is hard, because a lot of it doesn't make sense. It goes so much against, what the First Amendment is supposed to stand for, that once you get to the crucible of a criminal trial and you're supposed to produce evidence, I think that's why the jurors, were ultimately kind of, nonplussed, unconvinced. What's going on here? So,
right. We saw that reflected in the actual
in the movie, yeah.
In the movie, with the juror comments, like Rana juror, when they asked him what would it have taken to get a conviction, and he said evidence. I mean, it sums it up. Abdullah, Lena Halberson earlier said that she was grateful to get the family to agree. Why did you guys decide to open up to Lena and invite her into your home? And and when you're in such a vulnerable situation, especially media in Tampa was not kind to your family or to Dr. Al-Arian. There was a campaign specifically by one newspaper, the Tampa Tribune, who was relentless in their attacks. And they seem to have had inside information or leaks from certain government officials from the Justice Department and people like Steve Emerson and Fector. I think his name was Michael Fector. These figures, these characters that were in this media company that was just simply part of this campaign against your family. But you chose to open up to Lena Halberson and show and why did you do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say that on the one hand, I was probably the most cynical about any kind of attempt to do sort of any kind of film or media around this, just because of that exact thing that you're talking about, the negative experience. I think, early on in the film, I think Lena shows that clip of the CNN interview with my mom that happened literally within hours, I think, or, within those first like 72 hours after my dad's arrest. And of course, the sort of hostile, insensitive, kind of ridiculous questioning by the CNN host, who sort of just fed these questions. And so I think our experience generally was always that U.S. media tended to be very much believing of the government. And then after 9/11, you add the element of sort of the fear, the hysteria, the fear mongering, and that kind of, the sort of churning out of these sort of terrorism stories. And there was really no reason to think that there could be any kind of thoughtful media treatment of the story. I think what appealed to us a lot about Lena was, honestly, one of the things was the fact that she was not American, because there is something that I think an outsider's perspective on the war on terror as it was unfolding in real time, that needed to approach these kinds of stories with a very healthy criticism and cynicism of the U.S. government, at a time when there was virtually no Americans doing that kind of work, if we're being really, truly honest. I mean, you could probably count on one hand the number of journalists who were doing honest, serious, critical writing and journalism at the time. I mean, people like Amy Goodman come to mind. Beyond this sort of handful of people, think about, what the New York Times was doing. Think about their responsibility for the lead up of the Iraq War, which of course started exactly 1 month before my father's arrest. So we're talking about these things were all unfolding at the exact same time. And I think Lena, coming from that background, certainly gave us a little bit more pause to consider the idea. I think the fact that she'd been to Palestine meant a lot, because this wasn't someone who was also going to ignore that context, right? That ultimately, exactly as Wadie just said, I mean, ultimately, this was an attack on Palestine activism at its core in terms of this politicized case and trial. And you needed someone who wasn't only going to approach it from the very obvious, glaring abuse of rights, First Amendment, civil liberties, kind of war on terror context. All of that stuff is all well and good, and I think it's really crucial, and it's at the heart of this story in this case. But there's also an element here about what people want to do to express themselves specifically in solidarity with Palestinian liberation. And I think Lena really brought that understanding as someone who'd lived there, spent time there, produced a film already about it. And I think that earned a tremendous amount of sort of trust and faith and goodwill. And then it just came down to just meeting and just speaking with her and hearing her out. That I think, the more that we talked and got to know her and her team and, Tuna, and then later when Jan joined the team as the producer, and it was just a really fantastic opportunity, I think, to just share the story. It doesn't mean that we weren't still nervous about it. The idea of having cameras in your home sort of right there when you wake up and they're right there when you go to sleep at the end of the day. And these were some of the most difficult days of our lives. I mean, you go back, I haven't seen the film in quite a while. We were just talking beforehand about the fact that we haven't watched it in a few years, and you kind of go back and you're reliving these moments. It feels very out of body experience. You're kind of sort of in shock that you're watching yourself living through these moments. But to a certain extent, you're also extremely grateful that there was someone like Lena who was there to capture it, because it's so hard to put into words the kinds of things that you see playing out on screen. And so, one of my biggest I guess, things that I'm very proud of is that I lost that battle within the family. when I wasn't sure about whether we should do it or not. And so I'm eternally grateful for that.
And they probably always use that in the future, say, hey, remember, you were wrong about Lena and you're wrong here again. So, but there's some vulnerable moments in the film. Like, when I see your mom, there's some raw moments and you can feel the emotions there. Like, when she was crying, she's afraid to go to the courthouse because she doesn't want to, hear the jury verdict. Or when she was, she hung up the phone and she said, I can't, I checked the website. She seems like, she doesn't know what is happening to me. It's very real. It's unscripted. It's like, and this is kind of before reality TV shows became a thing. I mean, if you felt like you're part of a reality TV show, Lena, how did you manage to get these images? These, especially, because people act different when the camera's around. Like I know myself, when the camera's around, I want to look my best. I'm controlling what I say because the camera's there. But it takes a special way that you're in people's home and you're filming them, yet you're able to be kind of not interfering or to allow them to express their emotions. Was that difficult, or was it a challenge, or how did that happen?
I think it's a combination of me spending a lot of time at Al-Arian's house. So we really got to know each other, and they got to be accustomed with me, and at times me and Tuna Andersen, the photographer. Sometimes I worked alone, sometimes with Tuna. And also mainly it's what they were going through was much bigger than me being there or us being there with a camera. So what they were going through, it was so important and such a big thing in their lives. So the camera, at that moment, and only in those scenes, it was just, And I think sometimes maybe for Nala, it was also comforting that we were there, because she spent a lot of time alone, and at least she had a witness to what she was going through. And for us, it felt great also making the film, not just for the Al-Arian family, but for all other families who are going through similar things. And there have been a lot of families. So it's just putting focus on this case, just to show the human side of it, the human cost of the government going after people like this. When,
You're right. Speaking of human cost, Professor Wadie, one thing that, of course, 9/11, the tragic events of 9/11 happened. None of those hijackers were Palestinians. Most of them were Saudi. Yet, after 9/11, it seemed like the major terrorism cases that the government was pursuing were to silence certain Palestinians or going after Palestinian charities, or activists and political figures, people like Dr. Al-Arian or the Holy Land Foundation case. And you almost felt like there is elements within the government, not to say the entire government, but elements within the government, whether it's the neocon elements or Zionist or pro-Israel groups that were exploiting events of 9/11 to settle scores or to silence people or to tilt the scales when it comes to Israel. What role, if any, did the Israeli government and pro-Zionist groups played in Dr. Al-Arian's case and other national security cases that are involving Muslims, and the role of Palestine in some of these terrorism cases that the Department of Justice was carrying out?
Well, so this is an interesting question because I don't have any insider information, specialized knowledge, anything like that. I think if you look at the record of the, sort of what interests were served in passing the ban on providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations, which has been the kind of the critical, it was passed in 1996, but it emerged as the kind of key piece, the key kind of legal basis for the majority of these terrorism prosecutions after 9/11, where the idea was that the crime, before, if the crime was, shooting or bombing or whatever, now the crime is support, right? Which is kind of breaking ground. And in the law, there's the kind of substantive crime, and then someone can aid and abet it, but the support is kind of, it's kind of complicated to get into the whole legal liability, because someone who aids and abets can be found guilty of the substantive crime. But here we have the aiding and abetting as the substantive crime, which is, a legal innovation that then kind of targets things like speech and advocacy. And I mean, certainly the issue of Palestine comes to the fore because you're dealing with a stateless population. You're dealing with a population who the government has stated, or a cause the government has stated over and over again that it's hostile to it. But I mean, I think the thing to be very kind of careful about is that these issues transcend the Palestinian issue, right? The Palestinian issue is more kind of like a gateway to expanding government power. So what the role of the Israeli government is, I don't know. I can't say because, a lot of times if you looked at the evidence, and this is, I think it in fact makes this case maybe even more important, is, when the Israelis were asked to help, and to produce evidence on, operatives of the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine, which was the sort of the foreign terrorist organization that the government claimed, the defendants were active on behalf of, were operating the so-called North American cell of, whatever that is. The Israelis will say, well, we don't really know who these people are. They're not really interesting to us. We're not going after them, which shows you that Palestine in this instance, and the other cases, the Holy Land Foundation, maybe even had even more legal kind of, legal precedents that were set that were more negative, and the result in that case was unfortunately conviction. There was a case in Chicago of two people who were targeted, one of whom was, interrogated by the Shin Bet, and he claimed he was tortured, and he put on a compelling case. The judge in the federal district of the federal district court in Illinois, the Northern District of Illinois, allowed the confession to come in, but there were no convictions on the terrorism prosecutions, on the terrorism counts in that case. Like in the Al-Arian case, the Holy Land Foundation produced convictions and very long prison sentences. So what you saw was almost like this is a kind of a test case or a test issue for expanding government power to go after people who are advocating on behalf of a particular cause that can be easily kind of demonized and easily easily associated with terrorism in, you know, in the public eye, or in the eye of official government America. And so I think that was a sort of a bigger lesson to draw, because when the Israelis were asked, you know, they said, we're not really that interested in this case, which also I think sends an even bigger message about how unfair of a prosecution this was.
But what about, okay, if the Israeli governments, it wasn't maybe necessarily they weren't as interested, but what about American Israeli advocacy organizations or Zionist organizations here in America? They sometimes, you even hear sometimes that they're even more hardcore than Israelis in Israel. So are there elements within the government that are trying to silence Palestinians and Palestinian activists, or those who you know, lobby for Palestine or try to impact policy when it comes to Palestine, I mean, by using this legal mechanisms?
I mean, I think certainly if you go back to the material support law, so again, the debate on that law, the congressional record, and you see the groups that were active pushing for the law to be passed, this ban on providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations, which includes advocacy, the basis of which was the idea that there are these terrorist groups in the United States raising money under cover of humanitarian activity, which to my mind was already a very questionable proposition, right? I have never seen the evidence that the United States was being used by terrorist organizations to raise money under the cover of humanitarian activity. But putting that aside, if you look at it, for sure, there were groups like the Anti-Defamation League that were pushing for the passage of the law, you know, as opposed to the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee was pushing, you know, for the law not to be passed. You know, the ACLU was against the passage of the law. So there was this conflict over this law, which is kind of like the nucleus, because even though the main charge in the Al-Arian prosecution was a RICO charge, you know, that's the statute that was passed in the late 60s to go after the mafia. They wanted to,
racketeering and
Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act of 1968. Yeah, and the thing about that is, you know, it's kind of almost facile, right? Those groups are racketeering, influenced, and corrupt. They're existing to make money via criminal means. You know, one thing you can say for sure, you know, even if you find the most violent person in the world on behalf of a terrorist organization, they're not in it for the money, right? So it's facile. The logic is weak. It's easy to you know, expose if you can get someone to listen in an unbiased manner. And that's where a lot of these laws kind of put the thumb on the scale of the government.
Right. So speaking of that, a lot of these cases would not have been possible, turning to you, Abdullah, before 9/11. You know, the landscape changed, the environment changed. In fact, this prosecution of your father and targeting of your family didn't start after 9/11. It started way before that. How early, I mean, later on, did you find out that your family was being targeted? And were there attempts before to try to prosecute your father and those attempts failed? And, you know, what changed after 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, and this is something that I think it's crucial even in the broader picture of this festival and sort of thinking about these films and everything that everyone's been talking about the last few weeks, obviously with the 20th anniversary, people commemorating obviously the events of 9/11 and the way that it's changed the world. You know, I think we also have to acknowledge the ways that there are so many roots of what the post 9/11 world produced in the years leading up to it, especially that kind of initial, you know, decade after the Cold War. So really in the 1990s, when the US government really begins to shift its priorities and its resources and its sort of like threat assessments, you know, strategic threat assessments at all levels of the government, as far as sort of who the next threat is. And then it sort of shifts away from communism in the Soviet Union and toward this idea that, you know, Islam and Muslims, and we saw this in people like Bernard Lewis writing, you know, The Roots of Muslim Rage, and we saw it with Samuel Huntington talking about a clash of civilizations between quote unquote Islam and the West, however you define those categories. And I think that we saw the way that those resources were then being marshaled toward things like mass surveillance of Muslims, really going back to the mid-90s. In the case of my father, for instance, as someone who was an outspoken critic of the Oslo process that was clearly going to reap tremendous harm and damage by cementing an apartheid reality in Palestine, the US government, which had, of course, endorsed and really sort of pushed for Oslo to happen, began to try and silence and intimidate anyone who was in any way kind of critical of it. And so I think this is really what we start to see in terms of the surveillance of phone calls of activists, intimidation of their various projects. They have charities, think tanks, schools, any kind of institution that at least my father was involved in organizing ends up being part of that kind of mass surveillance network among all of these various institutions. And so I think it's important to at least think about sort of the way that there were roots of this before 9/11. We see it also in terms of not just with his case, sort of the US government attempting to a certain extent to try to bring those charges, but we saw the university trying to fire him from his position. Eventually, they conducted a massive review of all of the activities that were taking place on campus, and they ultimately concluded that everything there was protected speech, that there was nothing there that broke the law. The FBI came to the same conclusion. And so again, I think we saw that there were actually limits in terms of, it's one thing to be surveilling people in sort of pursuing these kinds of harassment policies. It's a very different thing to try to bring an actual criminal prosecution. And I think that's really where 9/11, quote unquote, changes everything, right? That this is the moment where the Justice Department believes that it can bring a very flimsy indictment and really just use fear, intimidation, coercion, and just sort of playing on the emotions of the moment and the hysteria of the moment to try to bring up secure convictions. And of course, that ended up actually proving to be not true. But that was certainly the assumption, I think, that the entire case was built on when the Justice Department actually pursued those charges in 2002 to 2003 as it was building that indictment. But because ultimately, as we've seen, there really was no case, there was no evidence beyond just activists pursuing the issues that they're concerned with and passionate about.
If you're just joining us, this is, I almost said my radio show because I always say that. By the way, my plug for my show on WMNF is True Talk every Thursday at 11 a.m. with my co-host Summer. WMNF is based in Tampa. Lena, speaking of media, as a non-American European person looking at the American media at the time and the coverage of the Samuel Al-Arian case, did you think that Samuel Al-Arian and his co-defendants would have a fair trial in Tampa? And what was that coverage like? I mean, if you can try to describe it, like the coverage around that trial.
Well, it was very, very negative, and it was very, very hostile towards Samuel Al-Arian, like most mainstream media. And I think it was easier for me, like coming from the outside with a different perspective, because the kind of treatment that they got in the media, you wouldn't get that in Norway.
But you had been, for example, sorry to cut you off, just and hold that thought. You have been to Israel or Palestine and even did a film before this, Stone's Throw Away, about Palestinian children. So you've seen the coverage and the impact. Did you see that there was a very, was there a pro-Israel slant to the coverage, an anti-Palestinian in watching coverage in Tampa and in the American media in general surrounding this case?
Yes, and also I've experienced like traveling around with a film from Palestine where it's only children. It's a documentary only about children, and a lot of places where I went, they tried to stop the screening of the film without even having seen the film. So I realized that
when they say they stopped, who tried to stop?
Well, I don't know who they were, but there were always somebody complaining and always somebody attending a screening, sitting in the back with the arms crossed like this and raise their hand and say, "What about the suicide bombers?" And so talking about the Palestinian issue and talking about what was going on in Palestine in the States, I realized that was really, really difficult. And someone like Samuel Al-Arian, who's a very important activist, I don't find it strange that he is trying, or somebody's trying to silence him, and that was obvious. And the whole case, I was sitting in the courthouse on a daily basis, and I was waiting for the evidence, and I never saw any evidence. So, and I looked around and I talked to the other journalists that were there, and I was just wondering why don't they see it? It's like, why don't they, instead of continuing to talk about Sami Al-Arian's case, why is nobody talking about this prosecution? Why is nobody talking about
the lack of evidence, basically?
The lack of evidence. Why do they not turn it around? And
it seems like, yeah, go ahead.
After the trial, it started a little bit. But
after the verdict?
After the verdict, yeah.
Did you expect the verdict to be not guilty the way it was?
Well, if I were in the jury, I would say no, not guilty. So, but I didn't expect. I thought it would be a happy ending to the film. And I was on my way back to Norway, and I thought, okay, now I can.
Story's over.
Back home. Story's over. Happy ending, but no.
I don't know if you were in the courtroom, Wadie, and actually, Linda Marino, we wanted her to be part of this panel, and she was Dr. Al-Arian's attorney, and she's featured in the film as herself. Different than the Mauritanian, which we watched the other day, and Nancy Hollander was Jodie Foster was acting on as Nancy Hollander. But in this documentary, you had Linda Marino. She's actually traveling, couldn't be with us on the panel today, but she reminded me of some crazy things that were happening in the trial. And she actually did mention that being part of that trial and taking on that case changed the trajectory of her career for the past 2 decades, 20 years. And she said she had to read it like 3 times, the indictment, to see where the crime was, because it just seemed like these are some activists advocating for Palestinians. You may not like what they're advocating for, but at the end, they were just advocating and holding conferences and giving speeches. But she said one of the things that they had that happened in the trial was that the part of the prosecution, they're trying to prosecute Dr. Sami Al-Arian because of a dream, not a dream that he dreamt, but a dream that his co-defendant Hatem Fariz dreamt. And Wadie, you were the co-counsel for Hatem Fariz, and apparently Hatem had a dream, and then he was telling somebody about this dream on the phone, and that came into evidence in the court. And then Linda Marino and her co-counsel, Mr. Moffat, said that they had to go find a dream interpreter or a dream expert. But can you tell us a little bit about that story, about this dream that happened, and how did something so ridiculous actually end up in court when you would think that such things would not, be used by a prosecution? You might be on mute.
You're muted, Wadie.
Yes, sorry about that. I have a vague recollection of this. So there's a couple of things. The first is, when the allegations, when the charges are those of conspiracy, at some point, and this was a battle that was going on, because if you followed the trial, the defense kept objecting on so-called hearsay grounds. You can't say so-and-so said to prove the truth of that statement. Okay, that's hearsay. But there's a co-conspirator exception to the hearsay requirement. And what happens is, at some point the judge decides whether or not there's a conspiracy there, and all these statements can come in. And so the judge at some point just decided, he was convinced that there was a conspiracy here and that the defendants were part of it. And then all of this stuff comes in, right? Which is so clearly hearsay, so clearly speculative, so clearly grasping at straws. And that's what we saw in this case, was at some point, the judge just decided all this stuff is relevant, and there's a conspiracy in his mind. It's been successfully asserted, and then the floodgates open, right? And you know, I see in the comments there's a question about the bold defense by Linda Moreno and Bill Moffat, Sammy's attorneys. They just rested, no evidence was produced. I think that part of that strategy, which is a common, by the way, a common defense strategy, you know, you just say the government didn't prove its case, the prosecution didn't prove its case, which is a big gamble in a case like this where the government has been going on for literally months. But I think, you know, obviously this was a very powerful statement in addition to a strategy. A smart strategy was also a very powerful statement, because you don't want to dignify a lot of what the government was saying by challenging it, because it was kind of, you know, there was no there. And you know, the story about Hatem's dream, you know, sounds like more of the same. It's just kind of, you know, not really substantive allegations, nothing to kind of go on other than to say that these people are somehow dangerous, these thoughts are somehow dangerous, and we're going to go that way, we're going to attack that.
And I think we heard in one of the jurors in the film saying that, you know, the government was just wanting us, you know, she was saying something like, I'm paraphrasing, she just wanted us to kind of, you know, like think that there's something there, smoke and mirrors, where there's smoke there's fire, but without having real evidence, you know. Like they want them to connect the dots for them when they weren't able to do it themselves. When bringing up this issue of this bold or risky move of not putting on a defense, and when we say that for viewers, especially international viewers, you know, in American courts, you have when there is a prosecution, you go to court, you have a jury, you have a judge, you have the prosecution, you have the defense. The first up, the prosecution and defense, they put on their opening statements. Then the prosecution presents their evidence. That means, you know, they present their case, they call their witnesses, they put on the evidence, and they can call, you know, bring as many, you know, witnesses that they want to prove the government's case. And, you know, we're talking about a case where the government, you know, I think flew some 50 Israelis from Israel to Tampa. To be able to testify. They weren't all able to testify, but they were present. But they put on their case for 6 months. And after 6 months, now everybody's anticipating the defense is going to stand up and put on their case and maybe last also a few months at least. But the defense stands up, Bill Moffat says, we also rest our case. Abdullah, to you, meaning, and it was a shock to like, you know, well, isn't the defense going to put on any witnesses? And was that I mean, did the family, did Dr. Samuel Arian, your father, agree with this risky move? Did they actually take his opinion? Did anybody ask your opinion, since you were wrong about Lena Halberson, about whether they should do this or not? Were you in agreement with it? How, it's such a thing, like, because a person that's innocent is going to be eager to defend themselves. In fact, they're like, you know, the natural thing to do is just to go on that stand and tell everybody off and tell them, you know, I'm innocent. But that's not always the smart thing to do in the, you know, legal maneuvers. So how did that decision come about? And, you know, who was on board and who was not on board?
I mean, I think ultimately by the time it happened, everyone was on board, right? But that was a process, and it was a process that took quite a long time and quite a bit of convincing. I think, you know, one of the issues, exactly as you say, is when you're not an attorney and you don't quite grasp how the actual legal process functions, especially in a trial complex as this one, your natural instinct, exactly as you say, is to sort of offer up your explanations for all of these things. Especially, I mean, again, consider what the government did here is they spied on someone, on a group of people for 9 years or so. And then they cherry picked a small handful of random incidents across those 9 years of their lives, right? A phone call in 1994, a fax sent in 1996, more phone calls, a bank transfer in 2001. I mean, those were the kinds of things that they tried to piece together to try to string together this narrative of a conspiracy. And so your natural instinct as a human being is to say, let me actually explain, or let me put into the correct context all of these things that you are cherry picking and trying to present in the most sinister and violent of a light as possible. And I think that for that reason, of course, the initial feeling was, there's explanations, there's context, there's ways to sort of, shoot down every single one of these false allegations. And then, of course, you realize as the process unfolds and as you talk to the attorneys that they say, unfortunately, that's not the way that the justice system functions, right? That the justice system, we're led to believe sort of through like the Law and Order TV dramatization is, two narratives go up and you have to believe one or the other. In fact, the way these trials ultimately function is really about who's better able to maneuver within the bounds of what the rules actually allow in a court of law. I mean, again, Wadie can speak to this as well, like in terms of just how difficult it was to literally mention the occupation in the trial, right? This is something that the United States government theoretically acknowledges, that there is a Palestinian territory that is being occupied by a foreign Israeli military. And yet to even just mention that in court, you would get shouted down by a judge who didn't want any mention of the fact that there's an occupation. He didn't want the jury to hear a single thing about it. And so in that context, it became increasingly clear that this was not the place where you're going to be able to air any kind of truth. You were not going to be able, in this court, in this trial, in that moment, to be able to actually share the reality of what had been taking place over the course of all of those years. And that, in fact, the government had basically stacked all the chips in its own favor, and the judge was more or less inclined to agree and to grant them as much license as possible. I mean, they brought in an FBI agent who had been leading the investigation to testify for several weeks on the stand. And then the next day he changes his hat and he becomes qualified as an expert witness. The problem with allowing someone to become an expert witness is then they can just offer you any kind of opinion and try to proclaim it as fact. And when that person is also the agent that's leading the investigation, it becomes sort of this kind of dangerous mixture of, is he speaking based on knowledge or based on opinion? And of course, those were the kinds of moments where it became clear that you were not going to get an actual fair shake in terms of being able to really present any kind of a narrative. And then I think ultimately the legal strategy was you rest your case because they haven't proven anything, and you don't want to shift the burden, right? Ultimately, you're presumed innocence, and the burden of proof is on the government to prove something. They spent 5 months and proved nothing, and so then it was really that was the legal strategy, and we were all pretty convinced by it at the end. And I think Bill Moffat can be pretty persuasive, Linda Marino could be pretty persuasive, and so when they talk, you kind of have to listen.
Right. When they did, it just seemed like it was such a gamble at the time. But despite all these, as you said, all the chips were stacked against you. Were you surprised with the verdict? That in Tampa, with all the hostility, with all the negative coverage, with all this, that 12 jurors, not a single guilty verdict. And it seems like had that jury been allowed to continue deliberating for a little bit more time, it would have been complete exoneration, for all charges, because even with the hung counts, the counts that they could not agree on, it was like a vote of 10-2. There was only 2 people that were holding out. And this judge cut the deliberation short at the end. I think when he realized, some people are saying that he polled the jury, he asked for like a poll, to find out where they stand. And once he realized where they stood, he ended the deliberation. I'm not sure if that's what you recall.
Is this for me? Yeah. No, I recall the same thing. I mean, I think, it slowly began to emerge that, and I don't know if that's standard practice, but my understanding is judges are not actually supposed to be given any indication of what's happening within the deliberation, and that this was very much a kind of a violation of that practice. But in terms of the reaction, of course, in a lot of ways, you always have to hope and believe. That's the reason you're fighting every single day for all of those years. Obviously, you realize the odds are stacked incredibly against you. And I think, you always hold out for the idea that the one thing that can't be controlled is the jury, right? That every other aspect of that process was very much under the control. I mean, when we think about what the prison conditions were, the extent to which the government went to such great lengths to deny all of these men just basic ability to have a defense, denying them, access to their lawyers and to the evidence against them, denying them all of the rights that they needed to be able to just mount a defense. That the one thing that couldn't be stacked against them was, what was going on behind closed doors with the jury deliberating the case, that these were still 12 ordinary men and women who were chosen to come and make that decision, despite tremendous pressure and tremendous odds. I mean, again, I think it was no coincidence. I think you mentioned that there were 2 jurors who were considering conviction on something. They were the only 2 who, when polled originally, were regular readers of that right-wing newspaper you mentioned earlier, the now defunct Tampa Tribune, which of course at the time had been leading a smear campaign for something like 7, 8 straight years, right? So those were the kinds of things that we were certainly facing, and I think we were under no illusions that it was going to be easy, but certainly we were incredibly relieved and felt obviously it's a very strong sense of even just partial vindication based on those verdicts.
Speaking of the prison conditions, I actually received a message from Linda Marino before this panel started, and she said she had to overcome so many challenges, things that she didn't face before when defending other, defendants. She said in trying to review the indictment with her client, Dr. Al-Arian, that she had to challenge this rule that did not allow her to actually bring the indictment into the prison so she could review it with him, because the indictment was too thick. Like, there was like a rule that they had in place that, she could only bring a stack of paper that was like, I don't know, an inch thick. And then later on, she said she was stopped from visiting him in prison because of her apparel. And there was some apparel rule that didn't allow her to go in because apparently, and I think either Lena or Abdullah can confirm this, because of her bra or something, undergarments had wires in them, and the prison guards would not allow a woman to go in to visit, a lawyer to visit her own client. And she said that her house was even burglarized at some point during the trial, and she interpreted that as some sort of warning. And so there were so many things. Are these tactics, Professor Wadie, are they common into trying to, to put these restrictions on defendants? Is this common practice? Is it just selective for Muslims or for Arab, or is this is it case by case? Are they designed to break people down and have them give up, or what's behind these very difficult and what would seem uncivilized rules as far as confinement and being able to defend yourself pre-trial?
Well, yeah. So you have to think about it from the perspective of courts are always going to be very deferential to the authorities that run a detention facility or a prison or a jail or whatever, and their rules on keeping order, keeping safety, right? So, these are the type of things that you see that are rarely challenged. So, the idea that an indictment would be so thick that it would challenge some sort of paper rule, usually doesn't happen. Indictments are not that long usually. So, I don't know how much of this was intentional. I obviously wasn't, involved in those types of, I didn't come across those types of issues. I can say when I visited other, to be frank, much more dangerous and defendants, people who are, who were charged with and ultimately convicted of very violent acts in secure housing units or secure, areas of federal lockups, federal detention facilities. They do have rules like that. Like you can't bring in a pen. You have to only use the ink part of the pen. You get totally searched. Certain things are not allowed. So, that I think is less, I think those are the type of things that they're not such, sort of central issues, but cumulatively, you can see a kind of a pattern of harassment. I mean, I know that in the atmosphere in Tampa at that time, I was personally I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to make myself a target. A couple of times I made a few motions involving, things like trying to get some witnesses over from Palestine. And one of the prosecutors basically accused me of, making this all about Israel. And I'm doing this for political purposes. And I just want to get some testimony. It was, we were nervous that our communications were being monitored. and right after the verdict in this case, the New York Times broke the story of this warrantless wiretapping that the NSA had been doing. And, the government, when my colleague Alison Guayardo made a motion to say, did this cover, Hatem Fariz and any of his communications, the government just said, we're not going to respond. We refuse to respond. Confirm, deny, nothing. You're getting nothing out of us. So, I mean, ultimately, I think they maybe weren't. I would hope they weren't watching all our communications, but it was a little bit more of a kind of a surveillance culture than I was initially anticipating. And it meant that I personally, struggled to kind of communicate with the Al-Arian family, outside of anything kind of to do with the trial. I didn't want to give the prosecutors or anyone, fodder to go after me, to go after, Hatem, to go after any of the other.
Did you find yourself censoring yourself and your behavior because of this type of climate and of intimidation? Because one thing that I remember, when the trial opened up, they had these barricades downtown Tampa, as if there was like, a bomb squad, and it was just like a military presence around this courthouse. And the jury is coming in with this kind of climate, and people are walking thinking like, what's going on to downtown Tampa? But it seemed like that is, I've been to other trials at the courthouse. They don't have that. So it's not standard operating procedure. It seems as if they were trying to intimidate, and it seems it was even impacting the defense attorneys themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it sent a very powerful message. It said, look, these guys are dangerous. This whole thing is dangerous. I should apologize to Abdullah's mother, who, very graciously would try to talk to me. And I was like, maybe we shouldn't talk. Maybe we'll later. And I didn't have any interest in being rude or not talking. I was happy to talk. It's just the pressure of that particular environment. And, to go back to this point, you were talking about, and I think you see it in Lena's film, and Lena mentioned it too, this idea of Tampa as a kind of a hostile environment. I mean, our office, one of the things we could do that was actually good, because we weren't representing Dr. Sami. We were representing someone else, but who was caught up in this. I mean, just think about it. There were 3 people brought into this case because of one other person, and their lives were upended. Ghassan Balut, right? The jury was like, why is this guy on trial? Sami Hamoudi suffered a lot, and he was acquitted. He was acquitted, by the way, sorry for this mild digression here, but he was acquitted because I ended up meeting with, I'm not taking credit, sorry, I don't mean it like that, but basically Steve Bernstein, his lawyer, got his dad, got Samih's dad to come from Palestine. And my colleagues, Kevin Beck and Frank Godbold, had met with Samih's dad in the West Bank. I wasn't allowed in by the Israelis. I was part of this trip, and then I didn't get in. But they went and they met with him. And he came with all this information saying, look, this is what Samih did. These are the people he gave the money to. They're all just, local people. They have no political ties. They're just people in need. And so when Steve Bernstein got Samih's dad over to this country, I sat with them over a couple of nights and helped prepare his testimony, and explain, say it like this, don't say it like that, just in terms of how you present yourself. Obviously, it was all his testimony. But it was shocking to me how easy this was, because it was so clear. He had a stack of note cards, and he could he was credible. And Samih was acquitted because of it, because the government had nothing. But it took a huge effort. When I went into Steve Bernstein had a friend who he frequently worked with in Tampa, who let us use his office. So I went after work and after the trial, and we sat up a couple of nights just going through this testimony. And these were people all brought in because they wanted to go after Sami Al-Arian, and they made their lives. And Sami, after he was acquitted totally, by the way, he still spent 6 months in immigration custody, which is the limit of what the government can hold someone. They can hold someone for 6 months pending deportation. And Samih had already agreed that he was going to be deported. By the way, Samih passed away, I think 2 years ago. So the culture was crazy. And, I think the defendants wanted to be more kind of in it together. And we as attorneys were a little bit more nervous about that because a conflict could arise. I mean, I remember 1 or 2 issues I thought we should push, and I remember Linda and Bill were like, no, that's not a good point. I go, maybe it's because it's not good for you. But anyway, luckily we dropped that. But but basically we were operating in this culture where I felt I was being watched. I think one of the prosecutors, who was out-of-town prosecutor, lived in my apartment complex, and I was like looking over my shoulder. So it was a different time. I think now, with 20 years after 9/11 and 16 almost years after the verdict, things have changed. People's perceptions have changed, and this attempt to go after individuals for their kind of non-violent advocacy is seen as less and less legitimate. Ultimately, I can tell you, a lot of people in the government, might resist that. I'm sure there are plenty of lawyers who work for the government who maybe agree that it shouldn't be a priority. But I think on the sort of popular perception, this is a less tried and true tactic. I mean, I think the one, sorry, I'll try to just wrap it up on this point, but I think the one case where the government had success was a very tragic case of the Holy Land 5, the Holy Land Foundation 5.
Right.
And in that instance, I think, unfortunately for them, it came after the Al-Arian prosecution for those defendants, and it came after the trial in Chicago of a couple of individuals there, Muhammad Salah and oh my gosh, Abdul Halim Al-Ashqar was his name, where the government essentially lost on all the terrorism charges. So that this was kind of like their last ditch effort, and they really did pull out all the stops. And the judge, they even, after there was a hung trial, they replaced the judge and got a new judge who basically allowed the government to kind of steamroll the Constitution. So that was a real tragedy, and it's still
speaking of the Holy Land 5, and is there any hope, or are they at the end? I mean, is there any hope in changing that outcome?
I mean, I think it's going to be tough from a legal perspective. I mean, is there some basis for asking for some sort of executive clemency? I don't know who you would make the argument to. I think that would be maybe the only way. There, some sort of habeas motion seems, as a legal strategy, a long shot. Maybe executive clemency. But again, those individuals were also, especially the ones still in prison, to the extent that they're U.S. citizens, it's not like you're asking them to be sent back to their countries of origin where they could serve out the remainder of the sentence, which is something that sometimes happens. So, I'm a little, unfortunately not so optimistic. However, again, I said I'd wrap it up, but one of the things you saw in this case, you see it in the movie, is the community in Tampa was very strong, right? And the community also was. It's not like at that point in time the Muslim community in Tampa, with the level of Islamophobia being ratcheted up, and women coming wearing hijab as a kind of like, was something that the community in the general Tampa area community, I know, these were things that were phenomena that were hard to overcome, but they stood up for these defendants, and it made a difference, really. I mean, the average criminal defendant, if you go to your average criminal courtroom, federal or state, you don't see lots of family members or community members supporting a defendant. And here, the community showed up every day, right? Showed up every single day. And to the extent, and that I think helped change perceptions. It helped change it helped influence the outcome in the Al-Arian prosecution. And I think with respect to anything like the Holy Land 5 ever receiving some modicum of justice, the fact that they have a community behind them is what is going to propel it much more so than like a brilliant legal argument or strategy.
Okay. Speaking of community, Lena, you observed that both the Muslim community and the general Tampa community, Tampa Bay, And you did already mention this before, that there was this climate of fear after 9/11, especially after the arrest of Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, which was considered, one of the most prominent Muslim leaders in Tampa, if not, the most prominent. And that sent a very chilling, had a chilling impact on the general community. They were afraid. And a lot of people that were actually friends with the Al-Arian family kept their distance. So what was the reaction of the Muslim community, and what was the reaction of some of the other not Muslim community, but some of these Christian groups? And did you see a difference in that? Because I think when Bedier is saying the community came to the to rally and we're going to the courthouse, I think he's talking about the general community. I mean, I know I went to the courthouse from time to time as with my role as CARE, but there weren't a lot of Muslims there. In fact, there were actually more people from the Christian community and this organization called Hope that was there.
Yeah, and they were there and they were very supportive. And I think every Friday they had the demonstration outside the courthouse. And I think it was easier for them being non-Muslim fighting. I mean, it's like what you says, the Muslim community, they already had a lot of negative things, like a veiled woman in Tampa at that time, there's always a lot of negative reactions. While I think the white Christian civil rights activists, it was easier for them. So that was my impression, at least. Maybe Abdullah can say more about it. But my impression was that the general Muslim community were scared because they were also targeted, and this group that was really supportive to the Al-Arian family, they stood there, and thanks to them, also other people saw that, okay, if this group is supporting them, maybe there's something to it. Maybe it's, it's like you said, there were metal detectors, and it seemed like a really, really scary place. And they tried to humanize it and tried to put focus on that this was a freedom of speech trial. It was not a terrorist trial.
Right. I mean, Abdullah, on two parts, something that was very visible, in the film, and even just me remembering who the people that were surrounding your family at the time, and I wasn't close to you guys, but I would observe you from a distance, that, your mom was always surrounded by, people like Mel Underbaki and Sharon Streeter, and, these people were not white women, the Reverend, I think his name was Warren Clark. And in fact, one time Warren Clark told me, he's a pastor of a church, and he would say that he would go to visit your father in prison, like every Tuesday or something, and, minister to him. And he's not an imam. Your father is Muslim, obviously, but the person, the religious figure that would go and, counsel him and stuff in church was this pastor from a church, Warren Clark. It seemed like at the time, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, compare the difference between what happened from the Muslim community side and then this other community that was, coming to your side and helping. Because it seems like on one hand, your family seemed isolated. I can see that in the film. And then, there was this other group. How did that help? How did you get through this without the Muslim community necessarily embracing you? And, in some situations, people you've known for a very long time are now keeping their distance out of fear.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the way that these types of terrorism prosecutions work is that they're targeting the entire community, right? That one family might be sort of at the epicenter of everything and so the most directly affected, but the fear and intimidation was meant to run through the entire community. I mean, when you think about the fact that so many of those families from the mosque, for instance, were all visited by the FBI. And by the way, they weren't just visited at their home, they were visited at their businesses, at their places of work in a way that was meant to intimidate them, that was meant to also hurt them professionally, financially, and they were threatened with government action on their taxes, on any sort of misstep. And so I think that that's one of the things that often gets lost in looking at a specific case or a specific trial, is the extent to which. Now, having said that, of course, it was still extremely dispiriting and isolating to feel that you lacked that support, considering this was the place you grew up, this was the community you lived with your entire life. To see them sort of turn their backs, I mean, there's this sort of heartbreaking moment I think you see in the film, where Lema is forced to go to Egypt to spend time with family there, to spend the school year. I mean, that wasn't just to shield her from the fact that she was, experiencing this trial with us at a very young, vulnerable age. It was the fact that she was no longer welcome in the very Islamic school that was home to us for a very long time. Right? That this was something that had to happen because of that loss of support that existed there. Those are very real experiences that we also had, and it was incredibly shameful moment, I think, on the part of at least some of the leadership that existed both nationally but also locally, where this was a moment to stand up, this was a moment to band together, this was a moment to fight back. And if there's one thing that this story ultimately shows, is that there's value in fighting back. Right, that's what I hope, if you take away nothing else from watching this, is that it's important to still put up that fight for your principles, for whatever it is that you believe ultimately. And yes, I think it was also incredibly powerful to have the kind of support that Lena's talking about, that you're talking about, from other segments of the wider local community. But again, I have to mention here the fact that these were not new sources of support. These were long-standing relationships that my father had cultivated in his capacity as a local Muslim leader in the community, right? That he had worked with a number of these progressive church organizations. He'd worked with a number of these human rights groups and local civic organizations and churches. And that was the product of many, many years of them working side by side on things having to do with education locally in the Tampa Bay area on a number of different issues. And it was on that basis that they said, we know who this man is, and we're going to stand and ensure that he gets a fair shot in this trial. And so I think, again, and this is where I think it's important to kind of think about the fact that there's always a wider context to the way that these things unfold.
Okay, well, that wraps up our session. Thank you all so much for being part of this and being part of the conversation. And thank you to our viewers for joining us for this panel discussion as part of the War on Terror Film Festival. The film festival will continue throughout the month, every weekend in October. So next weekend we have the film starting Friday night, the film The Feeling of Being Watched, and then on Saturday the Newburgh Sting, and then the film called Terror, also Terror, and the Battle for Algiers on Sunday. So you can get the whole schedule by clicking on schedule on the screen that you're on right now at the website WOTfilmfestival.com. And for every film, there's going to be a panel discussion. One of the panelists is actually going to be a former FBI agent who actually went to jail because he leaked documents to the media about the treatment of Muslims. Terry Albury, he was featured in the New York Times recently. So he will be speaking, I believe, Friday night. So check out the schedule, spread the word, invite your friends to join us for future panel discussions and the films, and continue to support CCF. And thank you to all the sponsoring organizations that are sponsoring this film festival, including my organization, United Voices. And again, thank you to Professor Wadie Said, Professor Abdullah Al-Arian, Director Lena Halberson, for a wonderful discussion. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and Assalamu alaikum.